My next guest is Dr. Dan Kreiness. Dan is an instructional leader, podcast host, author, and speaker. Dr. Kreiness has worked in education for over 17 years as a school administrator, instructional coach, intervention specialist, and a classroom teacher while working in districts in New York City, metro area, in New York State, and Connecticut. Dr. Kreiness holds a doctorate degree in leadership and a master's degree in adolescent education and one in educational leadership. His original research and dissertation is called Transformational Leadership to Inspire Growth Mindset in Classroom Teachers. Dr. Kreiness hosts the popular Leader of Learning podcast, which can be found on all podcast apps and music streaming services, and was ranked number 7 on Feedspot's list of the best 35 educational leadership podcasts. Dr. Kreiness is also a published author, having contributed to chapters in 100 no-nonsense things that all school leaders should stop doing, and 100 no-nonsense things that all teachers should stop doing. Edumatch Snapshot and Education, Volume 2, Professional Practice, and the Edumatch Teacher's Recipe Guide to Survive and Thrive in the Kitchen and Beyond. I did not know that book was out there. He is currently under contract with Edumatch Publishing to publish a solo book. Well, welcome to the podcast, Dan.
Thanks so much.
Yeah,
actually, believe it or not, just to go back to that Edumatch publication, a lot of people don't know because Edumatch has become a legitimate book publisher at this point, and they have several titles under their belt, but that was the very first one. It actually stemmed out of a conversation that happened in the Edumatch Voxer group, I think all the way back in like 2016 or 17. And someone, probably Sarah Thomas, who is the CEO of Edumatch, said, let's put together a cookbook. And it's a legitimate cookbook, not like, here are some recipes for succeeding as a teacher, but like actual things that people can cook. And that was the very first Edumatch publication. And I put a recipe in there for a butternut squash soup that me and my wife and my family enjoy. And that was my first and Edumatch's first publication. It's kind of weird to say that and to remember it, but that's how it started.
Wow. Yeah, because I had Sarah Thomas on a few years ago, and I remember her talking about how she got Edumatch started, but she did not mention that cookbook. So yeah, a cookbook for educators. So definitely something to check out. So we'll start off with talking about the time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out.
Yeah. I like to think that, I do a good job and I've been very successful throughout my education career, but I'd be lying if I said there weren't times where I sort of got stuck in a rut and like you say, in the trenches and had to kind of climb out. And I think the most glaring example of a story like that is the first time I stepped into an administrative role. It was a unique administrative role in that it was all instruction, but at the school level. The title of the role was called Academic Standards Facilitator. And the way I explained it to people was that basically it was like an assistant principal for instruction.
Okay.
Which for me, because I'm so passionate about instructional leadership, made a lot of sense. Not that I don't like working with the students, but I wasn't the assistant principal, and therefore I didn't have some of those responsibilities in terms of student discipline and supporting students. My role was like that of an instructional coach, which I am now, but with evaluative powers and actually observing and evaluating teachers as part of the teacher evaluation process. So I actually got started in that job in like almost midway through the school year. It was right around now. We're recording this just before Christmas. So I think I had like 2 weeks in that school prior to the Christmas break.
Okay.
This was back in like 2018. And it was obviously going to be difficult for me to adjust and for people to adjust to me starting almost midway through the school year. And I felt that right away.
Yeah.
But really, the reason why I got sort of stuck in the trenches was because it was pretty evident that my leadership style, my philosophies on a lot of things just didn't really align with the principal that I was working with.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, I wouldn't have even known that at first because I wasn't hired by the principal. It was a very large district, and so the superintendent as well as some of the other district level administrators were the ones who did the hiring for the school level administrators, and then they just sort of place you at the school that either has a vacancy or the school that they feel like you're going to thrive in. But unfortunately, I did not thrive. And I feel like I tried my best, but there were also some personal reasons that unfortunately took me away from my work a little bit
Mm-hmm.
during that time. Had to take some absences due to my own illness for a couple of weeks and some family stuff going on, and I don't think the principal appreciated that. But there were also examples where, not in a confrontational way, but
Mm-hmm.
we just clashed.
Yeah.
Um, and the first sign of that was uh, the day before or the week before the Christmas break. The principal really wanted to make sure that no one, and I mean no one, was not instructing up to like the last minute
Oh,
of the
wow.
school day. Yeah, and right, like that's, I don't know. I'll leave my opinions out of it. I'm just going to tell the story. So she sent the assistant principal and me, the two other administrators, she sent
Yeah.
us out and around the school
Yeah.
to look to catch teachers doing the wrong thing and to write
Wow.
teachers up for not in using that as instructional time. And to make the rest of the story, long story short, there were at least a couple more times that school year where, although I didn't really think it was necessary, I was asked or forced to write teachers up for
Yeah.
certain things. And um, actually, I'll give you an example. There was a teacher that I don't know if I was in the classroom for an extended period of time or maybe just passing by. I did observe a teacher, not like officially observe that teacher, but like
Mm-hmm.
actually
Mm-hmm.
witness the teacher scolding her class.
Mm-hmm.
And the principal, although I felt like it could have been just a conversation between me and that teacher, the principal, like I said, asked me to write the teacher up and
Yeah.
make a big process out of it. There ended up being a meeting with the union representation. It became a big thing. And that teacher, believe it or not, although she did not think very highly of me, obviously at the time, because I had to write her up, about a year after this experience, or after I left the school, she actually reached out to me first by email and then over the phone. And we had a really
Wow.
interesting conversation because I guess it took her some time to realize, you know what, Dr. Kreiness, it wasn't you.
Yeah.
I know now that you were really trying to support me, and that's just what you had to do. And it meant a lot to me for her to realize that, even if it was a year later. And that's why I say I was kind of in the trenches, because I guess if I had stayed there long enough, I probably would have felt like I was being put into a situation and being told how I should lead in ways
Mm-hmm.
that didn't really fit my style, my personality. And so ultimately, um, I was basically asked to leave. It was a mutual decision, really, but I was basically asked to leave that school and ultimately the district. And since I have found opportunities that have fit me much better, um, but it was a really unfortunate situation, and I wasn't happy. The teachers I was supporting, ended up some of them not being real happy with me, and um, it definitely felt awkward and uncomfortable. And as much as it was upsetting to kind of hear like, oh, we don't really want you to come back
Yeah.
after the school year, I was really grateful, to be honest, to get out of that situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And those are definitely those trench stories that are, in this situation, you feel a lot of the time like it's your fault. You're doing everything you can. There's this clash, there's this toxic leader, non supportive leader. But looking back, you realize, it wasn't you, right? It was this principal's way of doing things. And it's eye-opening to see that like that teacher actually reached out to you and wanted to have that conversation. And I think thinking back, I've worked with APs that might have been in a similar, situations, right? And some of the steps that they made at different times. And like, it's just kind of interesting to, kind of see looking back, like, in a situation where you wanted to use your strengths as an instructional coach, but you did have that evaluative piece as well. And, not being able to make your own decisions in terms of how to handle something that you saw
And
a
it,
teacher doing.
yeah. And first of all, it wasn't even just that situation and
Mm-hmm.
scenario where the principal basically told me what to do in terms of writing this teacher up and disciplining the teacher. It was even when I conducted actual evaluations on teachers,
Yeah.
she would basically dictate even in the observations that I was doing. We all kind of had teachers that were assigned to us, right? That we were their evaluator. And I basically had to run my evaluations and scores by her, and she would approve them or not. And sometimes she, frankly, would ask me to change the scores. And it was definitely a bad situation. And like you said, toxic leadership. And actually, just to go back to something else that you said, like making it feel like it was my fault.
Mm-hmm.
I have two thoughts about that. One, I probably did feel like that a little bit. I tried not to, but I think that phone call and the contact and outreach by that teacher a year later gave me closure enough to the point where I was like, you know what? Now I really know
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't me. It wasn't my fault. And I also that's when I really became much more familiar with the term gaslighting, because that
Mm-hmm.
principal, as toxic as she was, definitely tried to turn the tables on me and
Yeah.
talk about how a lot of this was my fault, that I wasn't um I don't know the term that she used, but essentially, I'm paraphrasing, she made it seem like I didn't have enough of a sense of urgency, and that I wasn't getting enough done in my role. And it was hard to hear, but I think at
Yeah.
the end of the day I realized it was just her way of trying to make me feel bad, and
Mm-hmm.
again, I've moved on, and it's almost tough to talk about and rehash these memories, only because it's like, man, I was so frustrated at the time, and I've come a long way since to try and uh, forget about it, and like I said, have that closure. But it did happen,
Yeah.
and when you hear about toxic leadership, like if you haven't experienced it yet, there are
It'll come. Like,
there are those people out there. So
it's not if, it's when. Yeah, right. But yeah, and that's kind of the same time period I had an experience as well with a toxic leader in a school with a lot of culture issues. So, it's not like it's a thing I daily think about anymore, but looking back, it's like, yeah, I it takes a while. It still resonates with you, like kind of some of the things that you did and tried to work through that situation, right? So, let's move on to what you're currently doing. As a instructional coach, you inspire a growth mindset in teachers. So, talk to me about how you've used your leadership from your research, from your doctorate, and how you work with teachers in your capacity.
yeah, thank you for asking, because I think it's something that I do really keep in mind all the
Mm-hmm.
time. Technically, when I conducted my research, I did that research on school administrators, principals, and assistant principals. But I think anyone who works in this line of education where it's more geared toward adult learners,
Mm-hmm.
it's something that we need to keep in mind. Like the the problem or the issue that I try to tackle in my research, and frankly, that I try and tackle almost, I won't say daily, but at least weekly or
Mm-hmm.
semi regularly in my own work as an instructional coach, is teacher resistance and reluctance. And there was a lot of research into what is actually at this point considered a research based problem, and that is resistance to change, right?
Yeah.
Education changes all the time, or at least it should,
Mm.
to keep up with, modern day and future readiness, and what our students are going to need after they get out of our level of education, onto the next level, or even onto college and career. And so I do try to work with all staff members, even the staff members who may not be as willing to try new things, whether it's technology or some other type of innovative instructional techniques.
Mm-hmm.
And so I try and keep in mind a couple of things. One, and I think this is sometimes where school leaders falter a little bit, I really try and address the why behind
Mm-hmm.
why teachers are feeling uncomfortable about something. Because I think sometimes, and I heard it described recently, and I don't remember where, it's probably a podcast. I listen to a lot of educational podcasts. That it's okay when you're implementing new initiatives not to have
Mm-hmm.
everyone on board. And I think that's true, right? At least a vast majority of your teachers should be on board if it's like a whole school or a large scale implementation of a new initiative of sorts. But then those teachers who are still resistant, asking them why and really understanding, getting to kind of the root of the problem is important. Um, and just getting it out, like letting them get it out there. I think
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we say, all right, we want to move forward with this, and we know teachers are going to have a problem or be resistant, but we don't do enough to really understand why.
Yeah.
And I'm not even sure they understand why. So I think it's good to help them understand like what's the problem here. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's that they just don't want to take risks. And so I
Yeah.
think too, working alongside of that teacher and not feeling like you're coming at it from a level of authority, but
Mm-hmm.
really partnering with that teacher to say, okay, what what can we do to help you along, right? Take some baby steps, or take more time maybe than what's expected. Um, but just really addressing that comfort level. After I extracted the different themes from my research, I kind of boiled
Mm-hmm.
it down to an acronym of SCOPE,
Okay.
SCOPE. And now that you kind of caught me off guard here with this question a little bit, and it's a great question, I'm going to try and remember them. So S is setting high and clear expectations, like really being clear about what you want out of your adult learners. The
Mm-hmm.
C, as I've already alluded to, is comfort, like addressing someone's discomfort level and really validating the fact that they may not feel very comfortable about some kind of change that they're asking them to do in their classroom, and getting them a little bit more comfortable about potentially taking a little bit of a risk.
Mm-hmm.
The O is just providing opportunities to teachers, whether that's giving them more time or just creating some kind of system that's going to allow them to thrive in whatever it is that you're asking them to do. Um, the P is really for and now I'm kind of forgetting, but I think it's more for like purpose, like having
Mm-hmm.
everyone kind of buy into what's the point? Like, why would, because I think sometimes that's where teachers get reluctant and resistant. It's like, what, here's another thing that you're asking us to do in our instruction among the thousand other things that you've asked us to do. Like,
Mm-hmm.
why this? Why now? Um, and then the E is, it's really two things. But I think the most important, well, it's empowering, right? And as a leader
Mm-hmm.
or instructional coach, whoever, like really making the teacher feel like they're in the driver's seat, and making them feel like they are the biggest part of this push to change something, to implement something. But also the E could stand for what came out of the research as well, enthusiasm.
Okay.
um, you know, the leader or instructional leader should be enthusiastic about some kind of change, but ideally too, you want to try and get that teacher to be enthusiastic about what it is that they're doing and
Sure.
altering and implementing as well. So that was a kind of a long way of answering your question, but those are some things that are more research based, but I
Mm-hmm.
think practical in the sense that they can be practiced and preached by school leaders to help teachers really get through that uncomfortability and the reluctance and the resistance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's so often these initiatives that are just like, okay, It might be a book they want people to read and discuss in their PLCs. It might be, we're going to visit this in staff meetings once a month, something like that. But it's like, yeah, a lot of it's not laid out clearly, right? And people are just like, okay, it's another thing I have to do, and I don't really buy in, right? So it's yeah, definitely as a coach and supporting teachers, when you understand kind of why there's reluctance, right? Kind of tying that together. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of your thoughts when I ask about your writing, but I did wanted to dive in to talking about your podcasting. So you've been podcasting for quite some time, longer than me. You host the podcast Leader of Learning, and tell me like what got you started podcasting. It's a very successful podcast, as I mentioned in the bio, and you just crossed 100K downloads and 100K views on YouTube. So that's really impressive. What is your goal also with the podcast? Because we think like learning, right? It's that adult learning piece, but also you tie in leadership, and it falls under that edu leadership category.
So when I started the podcast, it was shortly after I really started branching out in terms of my connectedness on social media and at conferences and ed camps. And I go back to like about the year 2016. And coincidentally or not, that was around the same time that I became a full-time instructional coach for the first time. And I was kind of feeling like this imposter syndrome that becoming a connected educator helped me with. But as I got more connected to educators, not just in my own school or district, I kind of started to feel this sense of like, I think I can impact more educators than just the people, just my colleagues and just the people who I'm working with. At the time, I was in a very small district. So as I got more connected and as I was starting to kind of branch out myself in terms of just learning as much as I could about being a better educator and forming a PLN, I was like, and what I haven't said yet is I do have a undergraduate degree and some experience in broadcast journalism. Okay. And so I was like, I'm a good writer. I enjoy writing, but I didn't at the time see myself blogging consistently. So with my broadcasting background and my interest now in supporting educators on a more global scale, I said, you know what? I think a podcast is the way to go. And it's been amazing. I mean, actually, again, at the time that we're recording this, your interview, Dana, will be my next one to come out, and that's episode 150. And I've learned so much from everyone that I've gotten to interview on the podcast, and the overall tone and theme of the show is really addressing educational and instructional leadership from all angles. And the idea behind that is it's label-less leadership. Like I want my listeners and anyone who follows Leader of Learning, whether it's YouTube or the actual audio podcast, I want them to understand, especially if they're in the field of education, that they are a leader regardless of what their role is and what title they have. Classroom teachers, obviously school administrators, guidance counselors, cafeteria monitors. Like, I don't care what role you play, you're a leader. And I think just sticking to that kind of mentality with the theme of the show has worked pretty well over 150 episodes now.
Yeah, and it's one of those that I've been listening to for a while. As you said, you got started back in 2016. So, when you do a search, it's one of those that comes up because it's so popular, right? So, congratulations on your milestone downloads.
Thanks.
And that's just one thing that keeps you going, just like me with talking to people and getting their perspectives. So, as we mentioned, you participated in this cookbook by Edumatch, but you've also participated with Rick Jetter's 100 Stop series. So both of us were on the teacher's book, but we'll highlight the one for leaders that just came out in November, December of 2022. So your title is, or your chapter was Stop Expecting Respect Just Because You Are the Leader. So talk to me a little bit about that chapter.
Yeah, I chose that chapter, and I was glad to ultimately wind up actually writing on it, because I think it does align pretty well with kind of my brand and what I'm already doing on Leader of Learning. Um, and so actually what I talked a lot about in that chapter was in my most recent experience as an administrator, which was in the role of assistant principal. The principal and the rest of the admin team and I did a book study together on the 5 dysfunctions of a team.
Mm-hmm.
And if, by the way, if you're listening to this and you haven't read that yet, it's a really unique read because it reads like a fictional story, that
Okay.
there are characters in it. It's unusual. But there's a lot that you can learn from the situations that the characters go through in that book. And it is
Mm-hmm.
heavy on like the business side of leadership, but there's definitely so much you can learn from, if you're in the education field as well. But in that book and in my chapter, I talked a lot about how um, if you're not careful in terms of really investing in relationships and building that trust as a leader, what you end up having is what they call in that book an artificial harmony.
Okay.
So, I mean, we've probably all been in situations where your leader might not realize it, but the culture and climate is poor in the building and in the organization. People are gossiping, talking behind other people's backs. You have people, like I said already, that are reluctant and resistant to try and implement things because that trust isn't there, and it doesn't go, it's not a two-way street. It doesn't go both ways. So that's a lot of what I talk about in that chapter, and it aligns with a guide that I have put out for free on my website, just a guide on how to build trust as a leader. As a matter of fact, I just launched a free course on what I'm calling, quote unquote, the Leader of Learning Academy, on just that, how to build trust as a leader, because I really feel like that's such a foundational element to being successful as a leader, but having an entire organization be as successful as possible, like everyone on the same page and trusting one another. So it was a great chapter to write. It's chapter 13, I believe, if anyone listening has the book or is thinking about ordering a copy of the book. And yeah, I really enjoyed writing it. I kind of wish the book came out a little sooner, only because it felt like such a long wait. Like I wrote it a year ago, and then this
Yeah.
book just came out a few weeks ago. But those have been some pretty cool projects to participate in. Like I said, I love writing, and I think I'm really good at it. You mentioned in my introduction that I have a book contract with Edumatch.
Mm-hmm.
I've had that contract for almost 2 years now,
Mm-hmm.
and the book is still not out. So that probably says something about my eagerness to actually put out my own book. But writing the
Uh-huh.
chapters and contributing to these other publications have been really cool for me.
So is that book still in the writing process? Is it kind of in queue for editing? Where is that at?
I guess we'll call it the writing process.
Okay.
That's giving it a lot more credit than it's really due, but we'll just say it's still in the writing process.
Okay. So at some point we can expect a solo book from you.
I hope so.
Yes, yes. And that's a thing. Like, you have a lot of good thoughts and a lot of things to contribute, but like really, writing something on your own does take that extended writing time, right? I've been through it myself, and my book wasn't super long, but just making sure that you can, sit down and craft that manuscript. So we've had a great conversation today about your background, both as an instructional coach, as an AP, how you got your podcast started, and also about some of the freebies, like you talked about on the academy on your website, the free course, How to Build Trust as a Leader. Out of everything we talked about on the podcast, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
I'm going to go back to what I was saying about my why for what I do with Leader of Learning, especially the podcast. in that I really want people to realize their leadership potential, regardless of their title and their role. And if you're listening to this now and you also listen to the Leader of Learning podcast, you've heard me say this before because it's literally how I end every single episode of my podcast. But if you haven't, then I want to kind of leave you with this. No matter who you are or where you are a leader of learning. And again, that's how I end every episode. And I'm really serious about that and passionate about it too, because I think sometimes educators sell themselves a little bit short in terms of what leadership is and how they are contributing as a leader to their schools, their districts, the education field in general. And so no matter who you are or where you are, you're a leader. You're a leader of learning.
Yeah, that's something we really need to recognize more, I think, for like everybody in the building's that leader, everybody who touches the lives of students. Where can people connect with you and find you online?
I actually have two websites. One is dankreiness.com. The other is leaderoflearning.com. You can access all my stuff really from both. If you're looking for the podcast or the courses, probably the best bet is leaderoflearning.com. That's where you can find and access those resources, as well as subscribing to the podcast or the YouTube channel. And on social media, I'm just really about everywhere on the same handle. I've tried to keep it as consistent as possible. It's Dr. _ Kreiness. So Dr. _ my last name, Kreiness.
Great, great. Well, I'll make sure I put that in the show notes. Thank you so much for being my guest on the Out of the Trenches podcast today.
Thanks a lot, Dana. Thanks for coming onto my show too a couple weeks ago. And I really appreciated it. Thanks a lot.